Thank you all a great deal for joining us this Friday afternoon. It certainly is a pleasure to see you all. I'm saying afternoon, I'm on the East Coast, but I know folks are joining us from literally across the country. So for those who are on the West Coast, who are in Central Standard Time, and all of my folks who are here on Eastern Standard Time, I appreciate you and we thank you for joining us. On behalf of our founder, the Reverend Dr. Raphael Gamulio Warnock, in the entire Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration, we're grateful that you've joined us. My name is the Reverend Devin Jerome Crawford, and I serve as the National Executive Director of the Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration. And I'm joined today with members of our team who are a part of our Unlocked Voices narrative change training group. As we conduct this work, this liberation work, such a critical moment in the life of our country and in the life of so many that are connected to us. Let us be sure that it is not an accident that we've come together this weekend for such a time as this. As we approach the 158th anniversary of Juneteenth, a day in which freedom was announced to those in Texas at a delayed date, freedom of citizenship, freedom of being human, all these promises that were captured in the promise of Juneteenth. But we're here today because we recognize that these freedoms, that these promises have been delayed, and in many ways they've been denied. And there's no other space that is on full display than in our criminal legal system and in the system of mass incarceration. As we gather this afternoon, we recognize that there are over 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in our country. But not only that, we have to recognize that there are millions more that are in probation and parole in these open air prisons under constant surveillance by our government and criminal justice officials. This form of surveillance and legal punishment is in a real sense a form of neo-slavery. We're reinscribing Black codes, or we're reinscribing the legacy of peonage and sharecropping and a prison for labor purposes. And so we've come today to recognize that there is a fundamental problem with this, that we're in a moment of moral urgency in this country. And it takes all of us, especially those in the faith community, to leverage our voices, to use our prophetic witness, to shift the will in this country and engage in some constructive radicality as we move this country from mass incarceration to true liberation. And so that's really the purpose of what we're doing here today, to unlock the voices and to be prophetic witnesses in the world of what freedom and liberation looks like and how we build beloved community one with another across faith traditions. But we recognize that not only in Christianity, not only in Judaism, not only in Islam are there themes of forgiveness and redemption and love and community and redemptive power that comes when we come together. And so we bring the best of all these traditions together as we move as a moral force for freedom and liberation. So I'm grateful for this training and all of you who have joined us as angelic troublemakers and prophetic witnesses in this work. We'll be led by our brother, Reverend James Woodall, who has led so diligently as the co-chair of the Georgia chapter of the Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration, and our team from Phillips Merrick, Karen Phillips, Melissa Merrick, and Gloria Wilson Moore, who have helped to curate this experience. So thank you so much for joining us and for engaging in this work as we move together to end this crisis of mass incarceration. So at this time, I would love for my colleague, I believe Karen or James will then lead us as we go straight.
What I want to begin with is when we think about what Juneteenth is, we oftentimes really limit it to taking a day off, which is a very new kind of experience for a lot of us. But in a real sense, as we are talking about mass incarceration, this is a centuries old program that we've seen in our communities for nearly 400 years, if not longer. And so part of our hope is today that we can give some historical overview as to how we got here, so that ultimately we can understand what we're facing so that we can move forward. And so I want us to really begin with April 12th of 1861, which was the origination or the beginning, if you will, of the civil rights here in these United States. And why this is important, if you go to that next slide for me, why this is important is because as we began the civil rights, you see foreign entities like France and the UK or England, more specifically, trying to really figure out how they are going to support this new creation called the Confederacy. And so when you think about mass incarceration today, a lot of majority of the people that are incarcerated they're incarcerated and housed in these southern states that used to be a part of the Confederacy. And so I take us to September 22nd of 1862, where Lincoln issues his first Emancipation Proclamation, because oftentimes we think only about the last Emancipation Proclamation, but there were several documents in which President Lincoln signed. And this first Emancipation Proclamation was very, its genesis was birthed out of trying to deter, if you will, the French and the English soldiers in the crowns there of supporting the Confederacy. And why that's important is because when you think about resources, the slaves that were on these plantations in the South, they were economic capital. They were property. They were owned as chattel. And in order for the Union soldiers to be victorious in the Civil War, they needed all of the support that they could get. So this first Emancipation Proclamation was not some liberative kind of expression by President Lincoln to say, I believe in the equity of all people, but rather it was a statement of fact that says, we need help, we being the Union forces. And so President Lincoln recognized that, he moved. Next, we go to January 1st of 1863, which is the following year, where we oftentimes think about Abraham Lincoln's final Emancipation Proclamation, which was also very unique about this year, 1863, is in Georgia, we had the first codification of this distinction between who is a citizen and who is not. Why is this important? Because when you think about Thomas Cobb, who is in 1858, he's writing an inquiry into the law of the Negro in America. What he's really raising is this clarification as to who can be considered citizen. And so when you look at the U.S. Constitution, when you look at states' constitutions, what they're wrestling with is the classification citizen. And so once the Emancipation Proclamation, the final Emancipation Proclamation takes effect in January 1 of 1863, you begin to see what we all know to be black codes. We see expressions by legislatures and constitutional conventions all over the country, really particularly in that Confederate South, that are trying to remove people from being considered citizen. And so what's important with the citizen's arrest statute here in Georgia, as many of you may have heard during the time of Ahmaud Arbery's death several years ago, there was a citizen's arrest completed, or it tried to be an attempted citizen's arrest. And what's different is that until the law was created in a way that would distinguish Negroes, who were at the time what they called freedmen, if you were to create a situation where black people or Negroes or Africans, descendants, or however we classify these individuals, if they were not working, once this Emancipation Proclamation took effect, they were now considered vagrants. They were now considered slaves. They were now considered criminal. And why that's important is because that is the genesis for the body of laws that we have here today in these yet to be United States. And so if you were to look at an inquiry into the layers of Negro slavery in the United States of America, it is drawing comparisons of the individuals we see in our history books and we celebrate as our ancestors with criminals, with people who don't deserve to be considered citizen. Because if you are not a citizen, you can't vote. If you're not a citizen, you cannot run for office. We saw several, people throughout the South, particularly I remember here in Georgia, where we had what we call the original 33, and they were literally expelled from the legislature simply for being African-American. All based on the simple codification of this definition of what it meant to be citizen. Next slide, please. And so you get January 1st, 1863, that final emancipation takes effect. And as we know, the history of Juneteenth, it didn't get to everyone. Most of the states that honored this, that you start to see conversations about, well, what does this look like for our communities? What does this look like for our economies to allow these former slaves to now be considered citizen, to now be considered free and no longer property? And so one of the first things you see from the government perspective during Reconstruction is you start to see reparations. And the reparations come not to those who are formerly enslaved, it comes to those persons who just lost property. Reparations. Next slide, please. June 18th of 1865. 2 years passes from the origination of the final Emancipation Proclamation to this gentleman by the name of Willard Richardson. He publishes in the Galveston, Texas News. It's a local newspaper, and he publishes this very distinct pro-slavery. He's a supporter of secession, and they called him the Napoleon of the Texas press. But he publishes this article titled "The Negro, His Future," and which refers to Black people in the most blatantly racist language. He says things like, Sambo can't be trusted, and he does not like to work, and he will not work if he can help it. But instead, Richardson opines this. He says the Black man would rather steal, lie, and loaf for a living. And if slavery ended and white men did not force Black men to work, Richardson argued in this text that they would simply starve. And he says, and I quote, the extinction of slavery is simply the extinction of the Negro race. Let me say that again. He says the extinction of slavery is simply the extinction of the Negro race. He would observe that the South could only be cultivated successfully by those whom God, in God's providence, seems to have marked out by color to cultivate tropical soils. Meaning that there is a theological underpinning of understanding and consciousness what is happening on behalf of the Negro people. That God has identified certain people to be slaves by God's providence. And so as we think about what's happening with the Southern Baptist Convention today, the underpinnings, the genesis is marked by what Richardson calls the Negro his future. And so I push down to the next day after this is printed out in the Galveston News, and there's an order issued by General Granger in Galveston, Texas. So again, June 18th, Willard Richardson is saying there's no way that God could be happy with the Negro being free, because who else would cultivate tropical soils other than that which God has ordained? And then the next day, the issue is ordered by General Granger in Galveston, Texas, declaring that all Negroes should be free. And so he says, on July 3rd of 1865, it says our city, and what they're having, before I read that, what we're seeing is there's a conflict happening in Galveston, Texas, where there's one group of people who are in power, they're in elected offices, but you have the kind of military presence that you may see not in America, but in quote unquote a third world. Think of like in Iraq or Afghanistan, where American military forces are occupying local territory. But the president of the United States says all the slaves should be let go. The local mayor, the local sheriff, the local alderman, they're all saying, under my dead body, will they be let free? And then this general comes in and says, we order and demand that these people will be let go. So next slide. On July 3rd of 1865, there's an issue in the Galveston Daily News that says our city is constantly filling up with Negroes, most of whom come from Houston. The worst offenders, Richardson notes, were children of 12 to 18 years of age who seemed to be going about without any home or anyone to take charge of them or to exercise any control over them. What's interesting is the indication of children not working, because remember, children as young as 1 and 2 years old were considered to be slaves. That Black Negro women would be put into these jails because at the time there weren't any Negroes in jails. Majority of the prison population at the time were white people, Europeans, the poor. And so we talk about the criminalization of poverty. But then we talk about race, because now as women are either trying to get out or they're no longer, they're pushing back, they're fighting back. What they do is they throw the African women into the jails with these white men, and they birth children. And the law at the time said that any child that was born as as a ward of the state or inside of any penitentiary would be a ward of the state. And so when this order comes about on July 3rd, 1865, Richardson writes, our city is now filled with these people. They're now 12 and 18 years of age, and they have no job. They're not working. So they must be doing something wrong because they're not working. And so what they instituted were the vagrancy laws that we saw codified in the Black codes. But then I want us to shift just a bit back on the next slide to July 1st of 1865, in which this is the first known celebration of Juneteenth. And the Galveston newspaper publishes an article. Again, this is Willard Richardson's reporting, and he informs the public that he says a Freedman's Fancy Ball is planned for Saturday night, June the 1st of 1865. And the newspaper would make some silly comments about Othello being there in his flowing robes, joined by many and Egypt's dusky queen. And the article closed with a salutation that says, Galveston is a fast place, and its colored population a fast people. Joy go with them. And what was ironic is that he's not saying this in a way that makes the freedmen or our ancestors or the formerly enslaved people. He's not saying this as a celebratory kind of expression. He's making fun of them. He's mocking them. But what's interesting is that the ball actually took place less than 2 weeks before this was issued. And so on the day after the ball, the mayor of Galveston, his name is Charles Leonard, he would order the arrest of the Black promoter of the event and hauled him before the city recorder. And that man was charged with violating a city ordinance prohibiting the hosting of a public ball without permission from city officials. And that freedman insisted that he did obtain permission to hold the ball and tried to show a paper signed by a UN officer as proof. But the city officials rejected that defense, and the defendant was fined and then sent to jail when he proved unable to pay the fine. Criminalization of poverty. But then I go to the next slide and we talk about on December 18th, 1865, then we have, well, before I go there, what was interesting is that in that rejection of that defense, we started to see conflict between Union officers of the federal government and local officials, where the official who said, no, we reject that, was ultimately thrown into jail himself because the Union officer didn't really like a person on a lower level, basically, challenging his authority. And so the man was let go free, and then they were able to really celebrate the first Juneteenth. That's when we get to December 18th of 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified by 27 states. The ratification of the 13th Amendment represented the beginning of a new constitutional precedent that would abolish chattel slavery, at least to a certain degree, and eliminated the cause of the Civil War. Its two sections granted the federal government authority to private and state civil rights abuses. And then what was interesting is that even though certain states like Georgia didn't automatically ratify the 13th Amendment, once it was ratified by 27 states, it became binding precedent across the United States. And then we saw the state of Georgia and several other states here in the South ratify shortly thereafter the ratification. And then then that's where we get the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Next slide, please. June 19th of 1866, which is about a year or so, not even about 4 to 5 months later, we see one of the largest celebrations of Juneteenth recorded in the newspapers, which took place in Houston, of all places, on Tuesday, June 19th of 1866. And when word of the plant anniversary, it was a barbecue and commemoration. But once word became apparent, some fear a similar violent reaction to that event. The Houston Telegraph informed its readers, we earnestly trust that nothing will be done by the inconsiderate or the ill-disposed to interrupt or mar the merrymaking of their freedom. The newspapers acknowledged the right of free people, next slide, to celebrate the emancipation and urged its readers to let them enjoy its celebration unmolested. In the first 2 years after the Civil War, white-dominated Southern legislatures would pass black codes, as I mentioned previously, modeled after their earlier slave codes. And they were particularly focused on controlling movement and labor, controlling the bodies of African descendant people, hence the law stopping freedmen from becoming first-class citizens. Negroes were prohibited from owning guns. They were denied the right to vote. They could not create businesses. They could not own land, nor could they even run or hold elected office. They were not allowed to testify against white people or serve on juries. Those who did not sign yearly labor contracts with planters could be arrested. They could not sue. They could not give evidence or could be witnesses. On specific days of the week, even, they had to prove to the county police or the sheriff that they were employed. Georgia was the fifth state, and I speak about Georgia because that's where I'm familiar. But Georgia was the fifth state to begin the formation of these black codes. But you also had Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, which preceded Georgia, while North Carolina and Florida followed. Particularly in Georgia, at the meeting of the 1865 convention that would follow, the following was recorded. I found this very interesting. It shall be the duty of the General Assembly at its next session, next slide, and thereafter, as the public welfare may require, to provide for by law for the government of free persons of color, for the protection and security of their persons and property, guarding them, persons and property, guarding them and the state against any evil that may arise from their sudden emancipation, and prescribing in what cases their testimony shall be admitted in the courts, for the regulation of transactions with their citizens, for the legalizing of their existing and the contracting and solemnization of their future marital relations, and connected therewith their rights of inheritance and testamentary capacity, and for the regulation or prohibition of their immigration into this state from other states of the Union or elsewhere. This was the kind of thinking that guided these lawmakers as they really wrestled with this question of what does a new state that allows free men to exist. Their bodies were legislated. Their work was legislated. Their transactions and their marital relations were regulated. Their mere being was literally a product of state law. Or was it? Next slide. And so we think about June 13th, as you just saw the last slide that talks about the 14th Amendment being adopted, making now these free people citizens. So in 1864, 7 former slaves in prison just in Georgia. By the time that the 13th and the 14th and similarly the 15th Amendment became adopted and ratified, we had 147 people in chains and in cages just in the state of Georgia alone. Next slide. And so if you think about 1817 all the way to 1921, we saw the greatest expansion of incarceration in that time period. Before, I would argue, World War I. You saw the greatest expansion of Black people incarcerated. But what does that number look like now? And for context, when we think about, again, what's happening since 1970, which in 1970, we saw the war on drugs, and you saw this criminalization of race and poverty in ways that hadn't been experienced since pre-Reconstruction. And so since 1970, the rate of incarceration in America has expanded more than 4-fold, which is more than what was experienced just in that time period from 1817 to 1921. And so now today, the United States leads the world in locking people up. Many places in America have begun to reduce their uses of prisons and jails, but that progress has kind of been uneven, because although that number of people that's now sent to state prisons and county jails from urban areas has decreased, that number has continued to rise in many places as we begin to see population shift. And so those racial disparities in incarceration, they remain strikingly wide. And I note that what's interesting, the data would show us, is that women constitute a rising number of people who are now increased behind bars. So when you think about state totals of how many persons that are in jails, which means they're being held pre-trial. And so as a comparison, in 1970, we saw about 12, we saw about little over 10,000 people on average every year in county jails. In 2015, the total population just in the state of Georgia was nearly 40,000 people in pretrial detention. And that has expanded nearly 1,500% since 1970. And since 2000, the year 2000, the number has increased nearly 26%. And so that's just pretrial, but let's look at prison populations. Because since 1983, in this state, the state of Georgia, the prison custody population has increased 222%. And for a number, in 2018, there were nearly 50,000 people in the Georgia prison system. You do the math. And so race is as well as gender and geography, we are starting to see an increase in ways that we have not seen since the 1970s. The last thing I'll say as I close is the interesting thing about what's happened now, as we saw during the President Obama administration, is that the numbers began to decline a little bit. But right now we have more people in federal custody than we had when Obama was president. The numbers are increasing again under this last administration, which is the Biden administration. And so this goes to show you that this is not a black or white issue. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. We have a culture of violence that allows for us to incarcerate more people per capita than any other country in the world, times 10. And so at the next slide, please. So as we think about why we celebrate Juneteenth, the name of this entire training was from emancipation to mass incarceration. How much has changed, but yet still much remains the same. And so as we think about our narratives and how we take this moment to really pause and reflect over the history of Juneteenth, how we think about how our communities of faith can engage this moment to allow for us to build upon narratives of faith and safety and equality and imagination that allows for us to really build the communities that we know we can live in and be proud of. It's important that we move in that spirit. Next slide. So what are those messages? What are those narratives that we at the Multi-Faith Initiative are really trying to get our communities to engage? Number one is faith. No matter where we come from or what we look like, our faith teaches the power of forgiveness and that we are so much more than our mistakes. Unfortunately, there's oftentimes moments where we believe that the power of forgiveness allows for us to give people grace. One of the things that we said when we were just in Dallas is that what does forgiveness require of us? What does our faith require of us when people have committed harms in our communities, in our families, in our homes? What does it mean for us? Should there be an accountability factor? Should there be people who are just never going to gain forgiveness because they have not acknowledged the harm that they have committed? What does reconciliation actually look like? And so what our faith traditions all bring us to do is to wrestle and to hold the tension that sometimes we may not have all the pretty answers and the flowery messages, but the reality is that there are people in our midst, both those who are formerly incarcerated and those, unfortunately, who are victims, that are struggling to hold on to that faith that teaches that we are so much more than our mistakes. What does it mean for us to uphold a faith collectively that ensures that everyone gets a second chance? Equality. In communities where people are treated equally, regardless of their background, everyone thrives. But we know too often in our communities that sometimes is decided by the color of your skin or how much money you make at the end of the year, or even your zip code. That some people are not thriving, even though we want to believe that that's what our community should be. So what does it mean for us to build an equitable community? Safety. We oftentimes hear about, being afraid of walking outside of your house without being afraid to be shot or to be mugged, or, going to your car or going to the gas station. But what does it mean for us to build communities that are invested in programs that foster healthy systems that allows for there to be a better future for all people? Is it enough for us to say, we support public safety and we want to see greater investments therein, building facilities that ensure the safety of communities? Does it mean for us to put millions and tens of millions and billions of dollars into programs that we know don't actually promote public safety, but just make us feel safer? And then finally, imagine, instead of locking people away for mistakes, imagine a world where we can overcome all of the challenges we just mentioned, making amends and healing in our own communities. That is our charge in this moment as we celebrate the legacy of Juneteenth. But collectively, I believe, and we believe, that we can get the job done. Next slide. And so now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Gloria Moore, as she introduces our speaker for the hour.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. It is definitely my pleasure to introduce this group to Kevin Weeks. Kevin is an inspiration. He was our speaker at our Atlanta training a couple of months ago, and definitely inspired our group, the training class. He's a formerly incarcerated person who is now a freelance paralegal and also a celebrated author. He's won some awards for his urban crime fiction. He has a story to tell. And so I'd like to turn the mic over to Kevin and thank him very much for being with us again today to tell his story and how it relates to the topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. How's everyone doing this afternoon? I'd like to first thank the MIA and the Multi-Faith Initiative for allowing me to speak today. I like to keep it raw. I like to be upfront, I like to be honest. And being formerly incarcerated, the things that I heard today about Juneteenth were very impactful, and along with them also me feeling and seeing how a lot of our men and women, predominantly colored, have come through the pipeline. Now, there's a term that I use called, and which is the cradle to prison pipeline, but also it's just a pipeline to prison. When Pastor Water mentioned the young men and how they had enacted who is not working, that right there stood out to me. It stood out to me, and I said, "Wow, laudering." I said, okay, so I can see how all of these things came about. Okay, Kevin Weeks. In the state of Georgia, I did 21 years to the door, level 5 prisons. And I did what I did. And I had no quarrel about serving my time. In the process of me serving my time, I was looking to go into the Department of Correction, rehabilitation. I was looking to receive something that would help me to become a productive citizen in society. But I chose not to go to trial because my attorney did tell me, you get found guilty, that judge is going to sentence you to life. I did my math at the age of 33. I counted, I said, I can do those numbers before I can erase those letters. So I chose to plea out. I had convictions in 4 different counties. DeKalb County, 10 years, Henry County, 15, Clayton County, 19, Cobb County, 19. All ran concurrent. That was a blessing. God blessed me, and I took that and received that blessing. When I first was arrested, I said one thing. I will not leave the way that I came in. So I made my mind up at that point to change the way that I think. Now, coming up in Philadelphia, coming up in poverty, being raised in East Falls projects, being on welfare, there's a difference in being told how to be a productive citizen or to be a productive citizen than versus being taught to be a productive citizen. And I was raised from a good family, but I did not know the core aspects of being a productive citizen until I went to prison as an adult. When I went to prison, I took that time and I used that as what I call my sabbatical, to where I had to look at Kevin. I had to figure out what was Kevin doing wrong that was causing me to be in these situations over and over and over and over. I was tired. I was simply tired. So I started doing a lot of research. That was when I came across the 13th. I came across the Amendment 13th. So I'm like, someone told me about it. And so I was like, let me go see, let me go read this. So I went and got my dictionary. I went to the back and I read this. And I'm like, whoa. And I understood, but I didn't understand. Only part I understood is commit a crime, slavery. That's all I understood. The words in between didn't make sense to me, but I knew I needed clarification. I had to ask an older guy, I said, well, what does this mean? And he was an older fellow from Georgia, and he broke it down. He gave me Georgia's history. And he said to me, he said, Georgia, King George, he said, Georgia was known as a state when it was founded where they sent returnees or reentry felons. So I said, really? I'm like, this is interesting. Now, why am I having a problem in a state that was funded off of receiving convicted felons reentry, supposedly to make them better? I'm dealing with reentry issues today. After I've served my time, I am no longer on any paper. I'm no longer on any parole or anything. I have no court commitments. But I'm dealing with collateral consequences. Collateral consequences and discretionary disqualification. These are qualifications that are administratively applied to you that will hinder you, that will keep you in a slave state. If you're not working, if you can't get a job and you qualify for this job, far as skill-wise, and you know you qualify, but you can't get this job because you're a convicted felon, but no one's telling you this. They're not saying, Kevin, you don't qualify because A, B, C, and D. They're just saying you don't qualify. That's confusing. Like, what do you mean I don't qualify? You go get an apartment. Things are changing now with that, but they say you don't qualify. I had an Airbnb account. They found out that I was a convicted felon and they closed my account. Now, I could fight it. They told me I could appeal that. But once I started seeing this, and I was like, I have too much energy to put somewhere else right now. Not in that area. I'll deal with that later. And coming introduced into the Multifaithemi initiative when I first came home, 2022, it was mind-blowing. It was what I needed. And I wish that more men and women, we say we want help, but sometimes we have an issue in finding out, because this information is not in prison. This information, the EMI, the Multifaithemi Initiative, this information is not circling around on pamphlets or anything like that in prison. So no one knows that there is a resource. So I've made it my duty to do what I can to share that there is a resource, and that resource is available to men and women who get out of prison. And we are afraid sometimes to ask for help. The only way to come out of slavery is for me to do what I'm doing now. I had to break the chains here. The chains are no longer here. That's just for show. The chains are here now. So I had to learn to break that. And me being around individuals who have the same zeal that I have, who welcomed me with open arms, who embraced me, understood my issue, looked at me. They didn't lay hands on me all of a sudden, but once they started seeing, then they saw that I was there at these different events. Because in order for Kevin to make a difference, I had to get involved. I had to learn and understand what EMI means, ending mass incarceration. If you ask the average person that is incarcerated, what is ending mass incarceration to you? How I know this? Because I did this once I found out. And they told me exactly what I would have said. Oh, you're talking about reducing the prison population. There's a difference. And I had to share this with them, that ending mass incarceration is only a very small percent when it comes to weighing the reduction of the prison system. Because you have to finish your court commitment. However, I come to find out that ending mass incarceration is getting involved to stop people from going to the prison system, especially our youth. This is why when different organizations, different faith organizations reach out to me and then ask me to come join them and to share and to try to figure out how can I help them figure it out, I'm all for that, because I am trying to figure out what can we do? How can we do this? Now, once we figure that out, something came to me today. God is awesome. Something came to me today and I said, that's it. That's it. So the plan is coming together. And I thank you all for giving me this platform to speak. And as time go on, I'm looking forward to meeting you all individually in hopes to spend more time with you all to gain more information and more training so that I can be as equally impactful, not effective. I want to be impactful to reaching out to the community. And I do thank you all. And I hope me sharing brought some enlightenment into what men and women are facing once released, dealing with Juneteenth and slavery is still in its existence.
Kevin, thank you so much for your time and your inspiration and telling your story. We appreciate you so much.
No problem at all. Anytime, Gloria.
And one of the things that, Kevin, is always a pleasure, brother. But one of the things that Kevin mentioned was plans of action, right? Like the stories really push us to want to do something. People may be asking right now, well, I hear what happened, in 1800s. I see what's happening in the 1900s, and I'm living what's happening in the 2000s. What can I do right now to make a difference when it comes to ending mass incarceration? Well, if that was you, I'm glad you asked, and I'm glad you're here, because we have resources at multifaithemi.com/UnlockedVoices. And in those resources, and I think we'll be able to actually go through some of those resources, because it's as exactly as Kevin said, is only one small part of just trying to, decrease the prison population or the jail population. What we first have to do, as I love to say, is we have to interrogate our faith. Because if we believe that we know what it takes and we know what the Bible says or what the Torah says or what the Quran says, or, that's one thing. But what happens when we are facing crisis in our community and is not clear as to how we should respond? What happens when we are approached by someone who has been harmed or who has done harm and want to be forgiven? How do we respond to that moment? And so what we did was we have this faith and forgiveness worksheet, which we kind of investigate what are some of the more broader conversations about forgiveness in the 5 major world major traditions. We are also aware that these are not all inclusive, and there are other faith traditions that may not be expressed on this sheet. If there's an interest, we'd be more than happy to even go deeper. But we wanted to just start as a conversation starter, if you will, to really start talking about the interrogating of what it is that we believe, because a future beyond mass incarceration includes all voices and ensures that everyone understands where everyone comes from when we build community. Next slide, please. Next, we have our advocacy toolkit, because it's one thing for us to be able to develop ministerial sermons or congregational projects or community advocacy plans. But when we talk about the laws, because remember, Juneteenth is about the codification of emancipation and the effects thereafter. How do we get here? It's not because people don't like certain people that you become the largest housing of people in cages in the world. We've built entire constitutions, we've built entire codes and ordinances that allow for these things to happen. And so we've developed an advocacy guide that allows for us to not only understand policy and to know who influences the policy within a system, but ultimately to empower people to advocate for change. Because it's one thing for us to acknowledge the politics of what's happening. Like here in Georgia and Atlanta, there's conversations about public safety and people, fall one way or the other. But the policy that undergirds every single system has to be at some point a priority for our organizations and our communities if we are to truly be effective in ending mass incarceration. And so we invite you to look at that advocacy toolkit and really engage us in that advocacy toolkit, because we want to work with you and provide additional resources. We have people on our team that has done this work for decades, and we want to make sure that you are equipped with any resources you need, or for you to even share with us some strategies on how to be effective. Next slide, please. The other part is really engaging with those principals and those officials that actually make the decisions on a day-to-day basis. And it's important because as we begin to think about what are we going to do now, right? We're going to take Monday off, hopefully, and really enjoy what Juneteenth is really all about, which is the freedom of human personality, as Dr. King would call it. It's allowing ourselves to truly just be, not a day on or a day off, not a day of service or any of those things that sometimes become a little superficial, but really a day to just be, because Juneteenth recognized historically and both presently that for so long bodies of human beings were forced into labor. They were forced to be engaged in active employment that did not benefit them, but benefited an entire legal structure that did not include them. So Juneteenth for me, and I welcome you all to enjoy this as well, is a moment to just be. But after that moment of being, I encourage, I challenge, I implore you to do something to end mass incarceration. So in that list of resources, we have a plan that allows for you to think about, in the next 6 weeks, what can I do tangibly? Who can I talk to? Whose meeting can I go turn up on, as the young people say, and really challenge the critical questions of why do we have mass incarceration? What do we want to see done? Who do we need to get there? What do we need them to do? And ultimately, the the $1 million question, well, in this case, the $90 million question, why aren't they doing it now? Again, what do you want to see happen? And what do you want to achieve? Who do you need to get there? What do you need them to do now? And the $90 million question, why aren't they doing it now? If we are able to answer those questions in the next 6 weeks, we should be able to say that we were able to accomplish X, Y, and Z because we took proactive steps to get there. We didn't have to wait for a bill to come to our desk so that we had to oppose and to organize against it. We're going to be proactive in engaging these issues in our community, whether it's the municipal budget, whether it's the criminal code, the criminal section of the state's code, whether it's a bailout for Juneteenth, allowing people to literally leave the jail detention center and go home to be with their families. Those are the kinds of actions that we encourage you to take, and we're here to support you in that endeavor. And so with that, I want to pause and really just open the floor for questions and answers. And as you all, I actually just raise your hands in the chat and we'll call on you. But I see a question from ICM already. Do we plan to coordinate information about the legislative bills being championed by various justice nonprofits and distribute it to us so we can act together as a movement? I'm going to actually turn it over to answer that question. I'm going to turn it to Gloria, who is the policy committee for the state.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. That's a great idea. We know there's a database already existing that a lot of people are using. We need to coordinate that better, but it's one of the things that's on the top of our list. So I appreciate someone bringing it up. I'll check it. I think it was in the chat, James.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I'll definitely get back to everyone on that, but it's definitely at the top of our list.
And what I'll add is, as we begin to expand beyond just 1 or 2 states, part of, and I don't know if Reverend Crawford is still here, but part of the strategy is being able to coordinate not just inside of your local city or your state, but literally coordinate nationally. Because what's happening, and really is the impetus and the genesis for why we're here. Many of you may not be from Georgia, but what's happening in Georgia is literally happening all over the country. We're seeing billions of dollars spent on projects and quote unquote solutions that we know just do not work. They didn't work in 1893 and they don't work in 2023. And so what we want to do is be able to build a synergy amongst our communities. And that is really what the Multi-Faith Initiative is, to build a campaign that coordinates action, from direct action to legislative action to advocacy action, and really understanding the system at work. And the last thing I'll say, and I'll turn over to Reverend Crawford because I know he's popped back on, is we're working in a criminal legal system that is not just. I name that because most people believe that we are in a criminal justice system and therefore there must be justice. But if we assume that, we erase the voices of so many people that are experiencing real harm and real violence at the behest of we the people. And every single case that is filed in a court of law says the state of whoever, or these yet to be United States versus so-and-so. Everything that's being done in this unjust legal system is being done on our behalves. And so it is our charge in this moment to do something about it. Reverend Crawford.
Thank you so much, James. And I just want to lift up, and also Gloria, for your work as our policy lead. So we're engaged in a Freedom Faith campaign that was launched about a month or so ago, where we're championing 5 different areas of policy that nationally, but also we want to highlight these issues within our regions. And that includes ending the ban on SNAP benefits for returning citizens. As you know, there is currently a prohibition for those who have committed violent crimes, that they are no longer eligible to receive SNAP benefits. And of course, we know this has a deleterious effects on children across the length and breadth of this country. And so when we talk about the health benefits and care for children, that requires moral urgency and truly moral agency on behalf of the faith community. We're also looking at ending solitary confinement. Again, this is something that strips human personality from beloved community. As we know, a person is not a person outside of community. So ending this type of punitive punishment that has its origins within religious ideas and theology, this idea that you isolate a person for a period of time in order for them to engage in a form of penance in order for them to re-engage into the community. Time and time again, we have seen how this type of brutal separation from beloved community destroys human personality. So that's one of the policy areas that we are targeting nationally. We're also looking for appropriations for reentry programs for returning citizens. So how do we help support and provide wraparound services that connect people to housing, education, and the like as they are seeking to rebuild and refortify themselves beyond incarceration? Currently, we have several women across Georgia that are being housed in collaboration with the National Incarceration Association and the Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration, where we're literally picking women up as they're exiting prisons, getting them settled into these houses and connecting them to education, certification programs, to job opportunities as they get back on their feet. And we want to scale that program and get federal funding behind it to increase the effort. Sentencing reform is always critical as we're looking at ways that we're not punishing people for decades upon decades of their lives, and they're completely separated from those that they love. And then finally, ending cash bail as a way of ending this system and cycle of debtors' prisons, where people are literally languishing in prisons, not because they've been convicted, not because of anything else, but simply because they cannot afford to pay their bail. And so this is a moral crisis that requires prophetic witness from all of us across our traditions. So we're lifting these 5 pieces up in our Freedom Faith campaign. We're also calling faith leaders from across the country to join us in Washington this upcoming September as we host our inaugural legislative summit in DC, as we come together to convene around these 5 issue areas and then go to Capitol Hill to advocate with our elected officials across this country to push legislation that is central to the freedom and liberation of our people.
Well, I'm a believer that every meeting should end the same day it began, so we won't belabor any longer. So we want to, on behalf of the Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration and our entire Unlocked Voices team, I want to thank you for committing yourself and continuing to do the work that our souls must have, in the words of the late Katie Geneva Cannon, because people's lives are at stake, but the work that you all do literally saves them. And so thank you. If you don't hear it any other time, thank you, thank you, thank you. And with that, I'll lift up a simple but very poignant question. A very poignant prayer as we conclude for the evening, is that God knows and that we are all we have, but we are all we need. God bless you and may God keep you is my forever prayer. Take care and happy Juneteenth, everyone.
Amen.
Thank you.
Same to you.